Good evening, everybody. It is, as always, and I say this every time, it's really good to be here. And I'm not just saying that. It really is. I appreciate all of the kind thoughts, the things, the conversations that we've had over the course of the day. It's been a really good day, from my perspective. I don't know what you think. But I've definitely enjoyed spending some time with you guys and just everything that we were able to do. Thank you for the kindness to my family. They've definitely enjoyed that as well. So we are appreciative of you and your willingness to come back knowing I was the one speaking tonight. So thank you for being here, not being scared, and coming back. You may remember that I left you guys this morning with a question. Don't know if you had time to think about that or if you remember what the question was, even. So let's look at some things together. Be cool if I could have that interaction with you, but we'll just look at this and we'll see what we can do. Remember, at the end of the book of Exodus, chapter 40, let's look at this together real quick. Exodus 40, after we have the tabernacle that was completed. It was completely done, finished, and it was according to God's plan. So many times in the book of Exodus, it says this was God's design and this is what God showed Moses. And then you have almost the same thing repeated, showing that they actually did what God said to do. And so it was according to the plan, according to the pattern. They did everything that God had expected for them to do. And that was very important for them to do that. But after all that was completed, in Exodus 40, verse 34, the cloud... Remember the cloud, the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. Well, we have the cloud here representing God's presence, covers the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. We cannot come into direct contact with the Lord because He is holy and we are not. In Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1, God is calling out to Moses. And it says he's calling out from the tent of meeting. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, because Moses isn't allowed in. But then we looked at Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, very similar to Leviticus 1:1, except that the key difference there is that the Lord spoke to Moses, this is Numbers 1:1, in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, on the first of the second month, and all of this. So somehow, Moses was allowed to be in the tent of meeting in God's presence in some way. And I asked the question, how? What changed between Leviticus 1 and Numbers 1? Well, if you know how Numbers were, if you know chronologically how the Bible's laid out, between Leviticus 1 and Numbers 1, you have Leviticus 2 and Leviticus 3 and Leviticus 4, all the rest of the book of Leviticus. So there is something about Leviticus that helps Moses to be able to enter into God's presence. And I will say, all of what we see in the law of Moses in the book of Leviticus, there's some instructions on how we as a people need to be holy because our God is holy. And there's all of the laws that were mentioned. There was the clean versus unclean things. There were actually a lot of things mentioned about how to treat your neighbor and how to show love and that sort of thing. A lot of times when we think about Leviticus, that's not what we think. But that is a major part of it. There is a focal point, though, in the book of Leviticus. Right in the middle of Leviticus, chapters 16 and 17, talk about the Day of Atonement. And this is really a pivotal moment in Leviticus. There's actually some pretty cool symmetry in the book of Leviticus from, if you look at the Day of Atonement, look at what's written before and after it. It's really cool. Maybe one day we could look at that together. But the Day of Atonement was this major thing. It was one of the most important days. And actually, Jews today still celebrate that, Yom Kippur. It was just a couple months ago. I think maybe at the end of October this year. And it's the one day a year that they were required to fast. And there were some other important things there. Now, in this whole Day of Atonement, the thing that was really important is that they have a high priest who's able to perform some of these duties. And actually, the high priest is really important throughout all of Leviticus in helping the people to approach a holy God. And so, tonight, what I want to look at is Jesus as our high priest. In what way is Jesus our high priest? I mean, I'm sure you've heard Jesus called the high priest before. If nothing else, when Stuart mentioned it this morning, Hebrews 7, that shows us that Jesus is our high priest. Did you know in the book of Hebrews in general, Jesus is specifically called our high priest at least 11 times outright. There are many more times where it's alluded to that he is our high priest. And so when you think about Jesus, our high priest, first of all, you will not understand the book of Hebrews if you don't understand what Jesus being our high priest actually means. You know, in what way is he our high priest? Are we just saying that Jesus was a literal high priest, that when he was born, that was his job to enter into the priesthood and do all that? If you know anything about the priesthood, there was a certain tribe that you had to be from in order to be priest. It was the tribe of Levi. Was Jesus a Levite? He was not. He was from the tribe of Judah. So Jesus is not qualified to be a high priest under the system of the law of Moses. But Hebrews 7 talks about how he was a priest not according to the Aaronic priesthood through the lineage of Aaron, which, by the way, high priest had to be a descendant of Aaron, not just a Levite, but that specific family. But Jesus was a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, that is something that would take an entire lesson to talk about too. So Melchizedek was this guy that we meet in Genesis. It's sort of like just a passing story, but God pays a lot of attention to that. That's also why it's important to read the details of the Bible. That small story actually has a huge impact on our understanding of who Jesus is in general. So if you're not familiar with that, look into that, because that is really interesting. So since he wasn't a high priest after the bloodline of Aaron, in what way is he a high priest? How did the system of the priesthood foreshadow Jesus? What does that look like? And so tonight, I want to do something that you might think is a little strange, and you might wonder, is this actually going to be helpful? I hope so. But we're going to look a lot at the duties of the high priest, but specifically the clothes that the high priest wore. Because I think there's a lot of foreshadowing in what the high priest were supposed to wear. And we'll also talk about the Day of Atonement as well, because that is a huge aspect of this. But have you ever looked at what the high priests were supposed to be wearing? I mean, it's really interesting, and I think that this is going to help us a little bit. We're going to understand some things. And don't worry, there will be plenty of lessons for us to learn about what we need to be doing right now, even through all of this. So this is a picture. I'm very visual. I could read through all of the descriptions of things, and it does not sink through my skull. I cannot picture it in my own head. I need something to help me. And so hopefully this will help some of you. There's some representations of what the priestly garments would look like. And this is a pretty good illustration of what a high priest may have looked like. And just decorated in all of the things that he was supposed to wear. I want to look at a passage in Leviticus chapter 8 with you real quick. So in Leviticus 8, we have a description of the high priest Aaron being consecrated in front of the whole congregation. And so Moses is bringing Aaron up there, and he's like revealing him as the high priest to the people. And they go through this ceremony in Leviticus 8, starting in verse 6. Then Moses had Aaron and his sons come near and wash them with water. Wonder where he washed them at. From this morning, hopefully you remember, bronze laver. So that's where he washed them. He put the tunic on him, girded him with the sash, clothed him with the robe, put the ephod on him, girded him with the artistic band of the ephod, with which he tied it to him. He placed the breastpiece on him, and in the breastpiece he put the Urim and the Thummim. He also placed the turban on his head, and on the turban at its front he placed the golden plate, the holy crown, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now, if you've ever tried to just read through that and picture that in your head, it's impossible. I mean, what is an ephod anyway? Like, there's a lot of language there that it's hard to connect to, but I think we can try to look through this a little bit. And a lot of what we are going to be talking about tonight will be found in Exodus 28. Because you may have noticed here in Leviticus it said he did this just according to the plan that God showed Moses. Well, the plan was revealed in Exodus 28. And so let's look at some of this in Exodus. Exodus 28, he describes what the high priest should be wearing. And so he says, "You shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother, for glory and beauty." So the purpose of the clothes are to be glorious and to be beautiful. Notice it did not say that Aaron himself was glorious and beautiful. It wasn't about Aaron. It was about the clothes he was wearing and what God had said you need to put on. There's also something cool said in verse 3, Exodus 28:3. "You shall speak to all the skillful persons whom I have endowed with the spirit of wisdom, that they make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister as priest to me." Any kind of visual representation that I'm going to show you is not going to even come close to the beauty of what this probably actually looked like. God filled these people with skill so that they could make this in a way to honor him. So our attempts at recreating that, it's probably not going to be at the same caliber, the same level. And we don't have Aaron's clothes still in existence. That's long gone at this point. And so we're going to look, hopefully some of this helps regardless. Let's think about what Aaron is wearing, what he's told to wear, and we're going to start from closest to his body and all the way, we'll go work our way inside out. The first thing that we need to consider is there's shorts that he's wearing, and this is underneath everything else. That's Exodus 28, 42 through 43. Some of your versions might say linen breeches. And it was completely white, as linen is, and this would have gone under everything. You may notice what is said about that. "You shall make them linen breeches to cover their bare flesh. They shall reach from loins even to the thighs." This is to cover nakedness. And also, in verse 43, "They shall be on Aaron and his sons when they enter the tent of meeting, or when they approach the altar to minister in the holy place, so they do not incur guilt and die." That statement is going to be in a lot of these descriptions, so they don't incur guilt and die. There's something about these clothes that take the guilt that is being put onto the high priest that doesn't actually transfer to the high priest. It's like the clothes stand in the way between the high priest and the sin that's being put on them. That's interesting. Remember that. It's going to be important later. So you have those shorts. You also have a tunic and a turban. In Exodus 28:39, you find out that they were also white linen. This is going under everything that's there. What does white represent? Purity. And even there's a sense in which it's sinlessness. Because if you think about what the job of the high priest was, is to bear the sins. And so who can bear our sins? We need someone who's sinless in order to do that. High priest was not sinless, but his clothing represented that. And so he was wearing that on his body. And to be clear, Isaiah 1:18 is the passage that says, "Though your sins were scarlet, I'll wash them white as snow." And so the idea that white represents purity and the sinlessness, that helps there. We're going to come back to that, but let's look at some of the stuff that's on the outside. You have this robe that's mentioned in chapter 28, 31 through 35. It is all blue. It's also referred to as the robe of the ephod. We'll get to the ephod, but it covers all pretty much from shoulder to feet, and it's blue. It also mentions that the hem of the robe had pomegranates and bells, not literal pomegranates, but it said that you took yarn. If you look in verse 33, "You shall make on its hem pomegranates of blue and purple and scarlet material." Pause. Blue, scarlet, purple. Do those colors mean anything to you? This morning, if you were paying attention to what the tabernacle was decorated in, there were 3 colors mentioned. It was those. Coincidence? Probably not. So it had those pomegranates made of that, and the bells went all around. And the bells said that it would make noise as the priest walked around. And so as he was doing his duty, could literally hear him as he's walking around doing his duty. Do you know, this morning when we talked about the tabernacle, what piece of furniture we never mentioned? The chair. How many chairs were there in the tabernacle? There weren't any. No chairs, because what were the priests doing? They were constantly moving around. They were constantly working, as opposed to how Jesus is described in the book of Hebrews. After he made his sacrifice once for all, he sat down at the right hand of the Father. So this is definitely a distinction. It's different. The high priest, you could constantly hear those bells as a reminder of what's going on. Now, he only wore this inside the courtyard while he was doing his high priestly duties. And so that was with that. Now, here's a picture of an artist representation of what that may have looked like. So, again, probably looked much better than this, but it said that the pomegranates and the bells were alternating. A lot of people will point to pomegranates as a symbol of the Garden of Eden. And maybe that's it. Maybe it's like a throwback to the Garden of Eden, and we're connecting with that. And the bells there to make the noise. But that was all around. Verse 34 tells you it's a golden bell and a pomegranate. Golden bell, pomegranate, all around the hem of the robe. So it is alternating like that. On top of the robe, though, was this ephod in Acts 28, verses 6 through 14. Seemed to be this sleeveless piece. And the whole purpose of the ephod, by the way, was to hold the breastplate. We'll get to the breastplate. But that was the job of the ephod. It was also said to be of blue, scarlet, and purple material with gold. Somehow they made thread with gold. I don't know how you do that, but they did. And they wove it into the material as well. So a lot of what we saw inside the tabernacle, that was what was on the outside of the high priest. Do you remember what we said about the inside of the tabernacle? Who was able to see that? Just the priest. Everyday ordinary people couldn't go in the tabernacle to see it. But you know what they could see? The high priest. Walking around, really, the high priest looked on the outside like the tabernacle did on the inside. And so that's how the people saw that. That was their connection to the tabernacle itself. So that's interesting here. There were golden rings on these shoulder pieces to hang the breastpiece, and it says something about onyx stones. On each shoulder there was a stone. Now obviously you can read that, so I'm not going to tell you what it says. But on each one you had 6 names, that's Hebrew names, for the tribes of Israel. And so you have 6 on one side, 6 on the other. And they were encased in this golden encasing, and then it was attached, and he wore that on his shoulders. You might look at verse 12 of this. You will put the 2 stones on the shoulder pieces of the ephod as stones of memorial for the sons of Israel, and Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord on his 2 shoulders for a memorial. So in a sense, Aaron was wearing all of the people on his shoulders. And that served as a memorial. And it would look maybe something like that. And so it was encased on there on the ephod. So he's wearing it on the shoulders, one on each side. He was a representative of the people. But also connected with this was the breastpiece, the thing that would go over his chest. And that's verses 15 through 30. That was attached to the ephod. There were 12 precious stones, beautiful, I'm guessing. And each one of those were engraved with a name of the tribes of Israel. So you had all 12 that he would wear on his breastpiece to carry those names of the children of Israel. And I'll show you that. Verse 29, Aaron shall carry the names over his heart for a memorial before the Lord continually. Think about what's going on with that. Aaron, as the high priest, has all of the names of the children of Israel on his chest, breastplate, over his heart, and on his shoulders. In a very real sense, he was acting as a representative. One man acting as a representative of the entire nation. Does that sound familiar? Hopefully it does. Because we see someone later who comes who is a representative of everyone, and that's Jesus. And obviously, I think you can see that connection. Now, one difference here is, remember when John the Baptist was with a couple of his disciples and he saw Jesus coming? He said, "Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of Israel? The sin of the world. So the high priest represented all of Israel. Jesus represents literally everyone. And so he's able to take that even further. You may want to consider that along with the passage in Romans 5, verses 12 through 19, that talks about Jesus as being the one sacrifice for all. And there's a lot of connections that you can make there. That's for your own private personal study. I think that could be helpful. But think about it in that light. The next thing I want to mention is something I know very little about. That's the Urim and the Thummim. And I think there's a very good reason why we don't know a whole lot about it. Let's read verse 30. Exodus 28, verse 30. You shall put in the breastpiece of judgment the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. And Aaron shall carry the judgment of the sons of Israel over his heart before the Lord continually. So, that verse explains exactly what those are, right? Kinda. I mean, we still don't really know. We haven't got a lot of details about what the Urim and Thummim were. Like, what physically were they? I don't know. And how were they used? We do know that they were used to determine God's will, and we have that given to us. But exactly how that worked, some people say it was like casting lots. Well, God also tells them to cast lots at some time, so why doesn't he say use the Urim and I don't know. He probably intentionally didn't give us those details so people wouldn't try to like recreate it in some way. Like the Israelites were really good at making idols out of, they made one out of the bronze serpent that Moses made. Remember that? And so maybe that's the reason why we're not given a whole lot of instructions. Literally translated, Urim and Thummim mean lights and perfections. Those are both plural words. So lights and perfections. Can you think of anybody who would fit the description as being light and perfection? Obviously, I think you know. Jesus. He's the one that reveals the Father's will, like the Urim and the Thummim did. And he's the one that is the light to the world, and he is perfection ultimately. So that's interesting. Now, there's one more part of the high priest garb, and that was the plate of pure gold that goes on the turban. And that was Exodus 28, 36 through 38. The inscription on there, what it read was holy to the Lord. That was like what was imprinted there. And so remember, Aaron himself is not holy, but he's wearing this to represent holiness to the Lord, to represent actually one who was to come later that would actually be holy to the Lord. And that's how he was described. Now, in verse 38, it does make this interesting statement. It shall be on Aaron's forehead. Aaron shall take away the iniquity of the holy things which the sons of Israel consecrate, with regard to their holy gifts, and it shall always be on his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord. That verse didn't say that he took on the guilt of the people. It said he took on the guilt of the holy things. And that's hard to wrap your mind around. Let me give you some thoughts. Maybe this could be in reference to how the curse, you remember the curse on the ground? We talked about this morning. That the curse wasn't just on people, but it was on the ground too. As cursed is the ground, we have thorns and thistles and all that. Maybe as a consequence of our sin, the entire world is suffering in some way. You might want to connect that to what's said in Romans 8, 18 through 22, that creation was subjected to futility and eventually would be set free, and it's groaning to be released. And so maybe there's some of that. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on that, but that is something to think about. So that plate on his forehead, he's not really holy to the Lord, but it's just a reminder of who is. All of these things that the high priest is wearing would really make him stand out. Like, now it's obvious that, and remember, it was for glory and for beauty. We're paying attention to the high priest because God has set him apart for a task. It was obviously different, and these symbols mean something. But did you know that one day a year, the high priest would actually take off all of those glorious, pretty, sparkly items, lay them aside, and he would just appear in just the white linen, look like a normal guy. Do you know when that was? The Day of Atonement. And there's some things to consider with that. So this is the other part of the lesson I want us to consider. In the Day of Atonement, let's look at Leviticus 16. Because again, this is the focal point of Leviticus, this is really helping us to understand atonement for sin. I think hopefully by understanding this, we can think about our own atonement and what Jesus does for us. So here is the process of how the Day of Atonement worked. In verse 4, we're told that Aaron had to wash his body and put on the white linen undergarment. So he had all of that. And so what you see up there is probably about how he looked. He had that white robe, he had the turban, didn't have the crown, didn't have all of everything else. That was just what he had. He also needed a few things. And so throughout these verses, you see he needs one bull, that was to sacrifice for himself. He needed 2 rams, one for a sacrifice for the people, and one for as a sacrifice for him, actually. And he needed 2 goats. Those goats are interesting because in verse 8, look at verse 8. Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for the scapegoat. I don't know if you're familiar with the scapegoat process. We'll talk about that a little bit. But these goats, one was a sacrifice to the Lord on the behalf of the people. The other was designed to take the sins of the people and wander out in the wilderness and to go away. And we'll look at that a little bit. But here's what happens. In verses 11 through 14, Aaron offers a bull on the bronze altar as a sin offering to be his own sin offering. So that cleanses him from sin. Then it says that he will take a fire pan full of coals, verse 12, from upon the altar with some incense and go into the veil. And the incense would actually, in verse 13, cover the mercy seat. Otherwise, he will die. That's important. And he will take some of the blood of the bull, look at verse 14, and sprinkle it with his finger on the mercy seat on the east side. Also in front of the mercy seat, he shall sprinkle that finger with his finger 7 times. So he goes in and he sprinkles blood on the altar in order to be a sin offering for himself. So he goes in the holy place, the most holy, and he sprinkles that on the mercy seat. Remember that passage in Hebrews 10 that talks about how we have had our conscience sprinkled clean? Have you ever wondered what that means? Why does it say sprinkled? Because it's in reference to this. Because the sprinkling of the blood is what offered that sacrifice. And so he goes in and goes through this whole process for his own sins. Then he comes back out. And in the next verse, in verse 15, he shall slaughter the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people. Bring the blood inside the veil and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull. And so, really, I told you this morning. The high priest would actually go into the most holy place twice on the Day of Atonement. And so once for himself and once on behalf of the people. And that he was offering up that for the people. He also cleanses the holy place, the courtyard. And so that was cool as well. In verses 20 through 22, he lays his hands on the head of this other goat, and he confesses the sins of the people. And that goat is sent out away from the camp into the wilderness to symbolize God taking away the sin from the people. That was pretty cool. Also, verse 23 and 24, he will wash his body at that point and put the garments back on. I'm going to put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that real soon. He offers up rams as burnt offerings and ends up in verse 27, he cleans up. And one thing that's mentioned in the cleanup process is that the bull that had been offered for the sin offering and the goat that had been offering for the sin offering were taken outside the camp to be burned, to be disposed of, to be gotten rid of. Real quick, look at Hebrews 13 with me. I think that there's a connection here we can make. Hebrews 13. Verse 11. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the camp. When Jesus was sentenced to death, remember he was in Jerusalem, but he didn't die in Jerusalem. Do you remember where he suffered? Calvary. He was taken away outside the camp, and that's where he suffered. And that's the connection that the Hebrew writer is making. Just like the bull and goat for the sin offering were taken outside the camp to be disposed of, gotten rid of, that's what happened to Jesus too. So in a way, in a real sense, he was just like those sin offerings, only better. I want to make one more connection between high priest and this, and then I'll say some things about Jesus, and I think that'll help us to put this together. So, one day a year, remember, the high priest would take all of his garments, the glorious, beautiful garments, he would lay them aside, and he would come in the appearance of just a normal guy. He was dressed in white, though, so a sinless guy, but not glorious like he was before. After he took part in the sin offering, then, when that was completed, he put the glorious things back on. Does that sound familiar? Was there anyone else who laid aside his glory for a while to come in the appearance of just a normal guy, but who was also sinless, to offer an offering for sin, and then was clothed in glory again? I think obviously it's Jesus. And with all of this, I think we're seeing Jesus is our high priest, and this really matters. Why does it matter? Why is this important for us to know? Why was it important for us to go through those details and try to understand and have that picture in our head? Because it helps us understand more about who Jesus is and what he does. I guarantee you, if this week you spend some time, and I'll challenge you to do this, read through the book of Hebrews and read through with this understanding and see if there's not some things that make sense that might not have clicked before. Like we said, you can't really understand Hebrews unless you understand what was going on in that Old Testament system of worship. There's a lot of connections made, and I think it helps us to see exactly who Jesus is. I do want to finish in the book of Hebrews, because I think that would be really helpful. In Hebrews 10, this is a very familiar passage, but hopefully I can show you a little bit of what I mean. Hebrews 10. Therefore, brethren, since we have confidence, verse 19, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus. So remember, what does it mean to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus? Well, Jesus is our tabernacle. He allows us to enter in there. He is our Emmanuel. He is God with us. But he is also our high priest, the one who takes us there. Verse 20, by a new and living way, which he inaugurated for us through the veil, that is his flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a sincere heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. I think the imagery there is very helpful to see. We enter in a relationship with God because of what Jesus did for us. He sprinkled our hearts clean like they would sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat. And we were washed in pure water. We talked about the imagery of washing, what that looks like. When we're baptized, that's exactly what we're doing. We're entering into that covenant with him. And because of that, verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is faithful. Let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. And he mentions one way of doing that, not forsaking our assembly together. And then the statement in verse 26. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for our sins. All the sacrifices that the high priest did, remember, they did that once a year. And so they constantly were doing that. Jesus offered himself once for all. If we are going to look at that sacrifice that Jesus gave us and say, you know what, that was good and all, but I'm waiting for something better. There's nothing better. He did that once for all. He finished the work, so there's no way that we can turn our back on him. It doesn't make sense because of what he did for us. The last thing that I'll leave you with, Hebrews 13, verses 13 and 14. This is really encouraging. Really encouraging thoughts. So let us go to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come. In a lot of ways, we suffer the reproach that Christ did, but we do that because we're looking for something greater. We're looking for that city which is to come. And we are able to do that because of what Jesus did for us. He was the tabernacle. He brought us in relationship with the Lord. He was our high priest. He allowed us to be free from our sin. He offered the atoning sacrifice on our behalf. He's done the hard work already. Our job is to hold fast to that. To do what he asks of us, to be obedient to his message. And what we got to do is just ask ourselves, are we looking for that city? Do we even care about what God has done for us? I hope we do. And I hope that this has been helpful in thinking through some of the things that Jesus revealed to us in himself as the high priest.